Montana Territory, 1871. Dust swirled across the parched landscape, where the small town of Silverdale clung to existence between rolling prairies and jagged mountains. The summer drought had turned the once promising frontier outpost into a desperate place, where men's hopes dried up as quickly as the creek beds. Matthew Quinn had exactly $3.42 to his name, likely the poorest cowboy in the entire Montana Territory. At 26, he'd ridden more miles than most men twice his age, worked twice as hard, yet somehow always ended with less. His worn leather boots bore the scars of 1,000 cattle drives, his calloused hands testament to labor that never seemed to pay off. "A man out here survives by keeping to himself," he muttered, adjusting his faded Stetson as he rode his chestnut gelding down Silverdale's dusty Main Street. It was the creed he lived by since losing his parents to frontier fever 7 years prior. Trusting others had only ever brought him pain. The harsh Montana wilderness had taught him that a lone wolf fared better than the pack. You couldn't be disappointed by those you never let close. What Matthew wanted was simple enough. Steady work, enough saved to claim a small plot of land, and the freedom to live undisturbed. What he needed, though he'd never admit it, was something to fill the hollow ache that settled in his chest each night as he stared at campfire flames beneath endless stars. But Matthew Quinn had convinced himself that loneliness was the price of survival in a land that took more than it gave. His lean frame carried muscle, earned through years of breaking horses and driving cattle. Though handsome with his square jaw, light stubble, and eyes the color of a summer storm, Matthew rarely noticed the appreciative glances from young women in the towns he passed through. To him, romance was a luxury afforded to those with security, not drifters with empty pockets. As he approached the livery stable, he spotted a commotion outside the general store. A woman struggled with an oversized crate while attempting to manage a spirited bay horse. The animal reared, nearly trampling a young boy who darted into the street. Without hesitation, Matthew spurred his horse forward. "Whoa there," he called, reaching the scene in seconds. He vaulted from his saddle, catching the bay's reins before it could bolt. The horse's eyes rolled wild with panic, but Matthew's steady hand and low, soothing voice gradually calmed the animal. "Thank you," came a breathless voice. "I thought I was about to lose everything." Matthew turned and found himself facing the most striking woman he'd encountered in his travels. Katherine Forrester stood before him, 23 years old with honey blonde hair tucked beneath a modest bonnet, wisps escaping to frame a face both delicate and determined. Her blue calico dress, though mended in places, was clean and pressed, speaking of dignity maintained despite hardship. "No trouble, ma'am," Matthew replied, tipping his hat. He noticed her wedding band but also the black ribbon pinned to her collar, a widow then. "Your horse just got spooked by that wagon backfiring." "I'm still getting used to handling him myself," she admitted. "My husband always," her voice trailed off, the pain still fresh in her eyes. "Let me help with that crate," Matthew offered, already lifting the heavy box into her wagon. "I'm Katherine Forrester," she said, extending her hand. "Most folks call me Kate." Matthew Quinn, he took her hand briefly, noticing the calluses that matched his own, no stranger to hard work, this one. "You saved my supplies and possibly my boy," Kate said, nodding toward a small child hovering nearby. "We don't have much, but I'd be honored if you'd join us for supper tonight. It's the least I can do." Matthew's instinct was to decline. Getting involved, even for a meal, violated his code of self-preservation. Yet something in her steady gaze made refusal difficult. Before he could formulate an excuse, Kate added, "My farm's just outside town." "The white fence with the windmill," she smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Around sundown." "Yes, ma'am," Matthew heard himself say, contradicting years of practiced attachment in 2 simple words. As Katherine Forrester drove her wagon out of town, Matthew couldn't help but notice the curious stares from townsfolk. Only later would he learn what they were thinking. The poorest cowboy in Montana had just accepted dinner from the widow whose husband's murder remained unsolved, a woman struggling to hold onto a farm coveted by the territory's most dangerous cattle baron. The Forrester homestead sat on prime valley land with reliable water access, modest but well-maintained, with a small orchard and vegetable garden that spoke of careful tending. Matthew arrived just as the sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills. The aroma of fresh bread and stew greeted him before he'd even dismounted. Kate emerged from the small farmhouse, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her hair, freed from its earlier constraints, cascaded past her shoulders in waves that caught the golden evening light. "You came," she said, as though she'd half expected him to change his mind. "Said I would," Matthew replied simply, securing his horse to the hitching post. The 4-year-old boy from town peeked around his mother's skirts, studying the stranger with solemn eyes. "This is my son, James," Kate introduced. "James, this is Mr. Quinn who helped us today." The boy nodded gravely before asking, "Can you shoot Indians?" "James," Kate admonished. Matthew knelt to the boy's level. "Most Indians I've met would rather trade fairly than fight. They're just trying to protect their homes, same as anyone." The answer seemed to satisfy the child, who promptly invited Matthew to see his collection of treasures, rocks, feathers, and a prized arrowhead, before dinner. The small farmhouse interior revealed a life of modest means but immaculate care. Photos of Catherine with a broad-shouldered man, her late husband, Matthew presumed, adorned the mantel. The dinner itself was simple fare: venison stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches, but prepared with skill that elevated humble ingredients. "How long have you been on your own, Mrs. Forrester?" Matthew asked as they ate. "8 months," she replied, her voice steady despite the grief that flickered in her eyes. "Thomas was shot while returning from town one evening. They said it was bandits, but—" She glanced at her son before continuing more cautiously, "Some say otherwise. Must be difficult managing this place alone." "We get by," Kate said with quiet dignity. "The farm provides enough, though this drought's been challenging. What about you, Mr. Quinn? What brings you to Silverdale?" Matthew explained his life as a hired hand, moving with the seasons, taking work where he could find it. "No place to call your own?" Kate asked. "A man tied down is a man vulnerable," Matthew replied, then regretted his bluntness when he saw her expression. "Begging your pardon, ma'am. I just meant the frontier's no place for putting down roots unless you've got means or manpower." "Or perhaps having roots gives you something worth fighting for," Kate countered gently. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but her words lingered with Matthew long after he'd thanked her for the meal and ridden back to his rented room above the livery. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the wisdom that had guided him. Katherine Forrester had lost her husband, yet refused to abandon what they'd built together. Her courage in the face of such loss contradicted everything Matthew believed about survival requiring isolation. The next morning found Matthew at the general store, inquiring about work in the area. The storekeeper, a round man named Wilkins, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Droughts hit everyone hard. Most ranches are cutting hands, not hiring." He narrowed his eyes. "Though I did see you helping the Forrester widow yesterday. Heard she's been looking for someone to repair her barn roof and help with harvest." Matthew frowned. "Doesn't seem right to take money from a widow." Wilkins laughed. "Kate Forrester would rather work herself into the grave than accept charity. She pays fair for honest work." His expression darkened. "Though between us, she'd be better selling that place to Randall Simons before trouble finds her." "Simons? Biggest cattle operation west of the Missouri. Been trying to buy her out since Thomas died. That's prime water access on her land." Wilkins leaned closer. "Some say Simon's men had something to do with Thomas Forrester's unfortunate accident, though nobody's proven anything." Matthew left the store with an uneasy feeling. He intended to move on, continue his solitary journey as always, yet his feet carried him toward the Forrester farm instead. He found Catherine in the vegetable garden, her sleeves rolled up as she battled weeds that threatened to overwhelm her crops. James chased chickens nearby, his childish laughter a stark contrast to the worry etched on his mother's face. "Mr. Quinn," she greeted him, surprise evident, "I didn't expect to see you again." "Thought you might need help with that roof," Matthew said, nodding toward the barn where several shingles had worked loose. "And maybe with bringing in your harvest." Kate straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "I can't afford much." "Room and board would do," he replied. "I need somewhere to winter anyway." It wasn't entirely true. He'd planned to head south before the first snow, but the words came easily. Kate studied him, her blue eyes assessing. "Most men don't choose to help a widow with a reputation for trouble." "Most men haven't tasted your cooking," Matthew countered with a rare smile. And so began an arrangement that defied Matthew's every instinct. He worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, patching the roof, and helping prepare for harvest. Kate matched his efforts hour for hour, her determination impressive as she managed tasks that would challenge men twice her size. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch after James was asleep, sometimes talking, sometimes sharing comfortable silence as they watched fireflies dance across the fields. Matthew learned that Katherine had come west from Boston with her husband 5 years earlier, chasing the dream of land ownership. She'd been a schoolteacher before marriage, educated and refined, yet had adapted to frontier life with remarkable resilience. "Do you ever regret coming west?" Matthew asked one evening as they shelled peas together. Kate considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I miss the conveniences of city life. But here I've found a strength I never knew I possessed." She looked out across her land, bathed in moonlight. "When Thomas died, many expected me to sell and return east, but this is our home, James's inheritance. I won't surrender it to fear or grief." Her quiet determination stirred something in Matthew, an admiration that grew with each passing day. Despite his resolve to maintain emotional distance, he found himself increasingly drawn into the rhythm of life at the Forrester farm. James followed him everywhere, peppering him with questions about horses and cattle and the distant mountains. The boy's unconditional acceptance began to chip away at walls Matthew had built around his heart. 3 weeks into his stay, as autumn painted the landscape in amber and gold, trouble arrived in the form of 3 riders. Matthew was mending a fence when they approached, hard-faced men with gun belts worn low. He recognized the look of hired muscle. "Mrs. Forrester around?" the lead rider asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Who's asking?" Matthew straightened, casually resting his hand near his holstered Colt. "Blake Henderson." "I represent Mr. Randall Simons." The man's gaze swept dismissively over the modest farm. "Mr. Simons has a generous offer for this property, double what it's worth considering the drought."
Mrs.
"Forrester isn't selling," Matthew replied evenly. Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's for the lady to decide, Cowboy, this isn't your concern."
I'm making it my concern.
The tension might have escalated further had Kate not emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Henderson," she called, "I believe I made my position clear when you visited last month." Henderson turned his horse toward her. "Mrs. Forrester, circumstances have changed, water's getting scarcer, Mr. Simons is concerned about his herd making it through winter." "My answer remains the same," Kate said firmly. "This land is not for sale at any price." "A woman alone should consider her safety," Henderson said, his tone making the words a thinly veiled threat. "Accidents happen out here, like what happened to your husband." Matthew moved forward, positioning himself between Kate and the riders. "I think you've said your piece, time to ride on." For a tense moment, Henderson's hand hovered near his pistol. Matthew didn't flinch, his storm-gray eyes locked on the man's face. Finally, Henderson spat into the dust. "This isn't over, Mrs. Forrester. Winter's coming. Things get mighty desperate when the snow flies." With that, he wheeled his horse around, his companions following as they rode toward the distant Simons ranch. When they were out of earshot, Matthew turned to Kate. "You believe Simons had something to do with your husband's death?" Kate's face was pale but resolute. "Thomas refused to sell just days before he was killed. The sheriff called it a robbery, but nothing was taken except his life." She squared her shoulders. "I can't prove it was Simons' doing, but I won't give him what he wants. I won't let Thomas have died for nothing." That night after James was asleep, Kate brought out a small box containing letters. "Thomas kept records of every interaction with Simons," she explained. "The threats, the offers, everything. He believed Simons diverted our creek last spring, though we couldn't prove it." Matthew examined the letters, his concern deepening. Simons' tactics had grown increasingly aggressive in the months before Thomas Forrester's death. "Why not take this to the sheriff?" he asked. "Sheriff Davis dines at Simons' table every Sunday," Kate replied bitterly. "And without witnesses," she sighed, "I've been hoping for enough harvest to hire help through winter, but the drought." Matthew made a decision that contradicted everything he'd believed about survival. "I'll stay through winter," he said. "We'll bring in what crop we can and see this through." Kate stared at him, surprise giving way to something warmer. "Why would you do that?" "Maybe I'm tired of running," Matthew replied, surprising himself with the honesty of his words. As October gave way to November, they worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming winter. The harvest was meager due to drought, but Matthew's hunting skills supplemented their stores. He taught James to set rabbit snares and showed Kate how to smoke meat for longer preservation. Together, they repaired the house and barn to withstand winter storms. In the process, the walls Matthew had built around his heart continued to crumble. He found himself sharing stories of his past, his parents' homestead in Kansas, their deaths from fever, his years drifting from ranch to ranch. Kate listened without judgment, offering understanding rather than pity. In turn, she revealed more about her life with Thomas, their dreams for the farm, and her fears for James's future. Their conversations stretched into the night, illuminated by lamplight as wind whistled through the eaves. The first snow fell in early December, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse. Matthew awoke before dawn to find Kate already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "You're up early," he commented, accepting the coffee she offered. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "The anniversary of Thomas's death is tomorrow." Matthew nodded, unsure what comfort he could offer. "Would you like me to take James for the day?" "Give you some time alone." Gratitude softened her features. "That would be kind. He's been asking to learn more about tracking." The following day, Matthew took James sledding on a nearby hill before teaching him to identify animal tracks in the snow. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, his questions endless as they followed rabbit trails through the woods. "Mr. Matthew," James asked as they walked home, the winter sun already sinking, "are you going to be my new pa?" The innocent question caught Matthew off guard. "I'm just helping your ma through winter," he explained carefully. James considered this with a child's directness. "But you make her smile again, and you scare away the bad men." "It's more complicated than that, James." "Why?" The boy looked genuinely puzzled. "Don't you like us?" Matthew ruffled the child's hair. "I like you both very much, but sometimes grown-ups have to think about lots of things." "Like what?" "Like the fact that caring for people made you vulnerable," Matthew thought. Like the danger that seemed to hover over the Forrester farm. Like the unwelcome feelings he'd developed for a woman still mourning her husband. "Like making sure we have enough firewood," Matthew deflected. "Race you to that pine tree." They returned to find Kate standing at her husband's grave, a simple marker on a rise overlooking the farm. Matthew kept James occupied while she said her private goodbyes, respecting her grief even as his own feelings for her deepened. That evening, after James was asleep, Kate joined Matthew by the fire. She held a small wooden box. "I want to show you something," she said, opening it to reveal a pocket watch and wedding band. "These were Thomas's. The sheriff returned them after." She swallowed hard. The watch was smashed, presumably during the attack. "It stopped at exactly 7:42. Matthew examined the damaged timepiece. "I'm sorry, Kate." "That's not why I'm showing you." She met his gaze steadily. That night, Randall Simons was supposedly at a town council meeting until 8 o'clock. Everyone vouched for his presence. But his men could have done it. Kate nodded. "Henderson and his companions have no such alibi. I've tried telling the sheriff, but without proof." "We'll find proof," Matthew promised, though he wasn't sure how. The weeks that followed brought them closer as they settled into the rhythm of winter on the frontier. Matthew repaired items around the farm, taught James basic carpentry, and spent evenings reading aloud from Kate's small collection of books. Kate, in turn, mended Matthew's clothes, cooked meals that made the simple provisions seem luxurious, and shared songs from her childhood in Boston. Christmas approached, bringing a festive mood despite their modest circumstances. Matthew secretly carved a wooden horse for James and fashioned a delicate hair comb for Kate from a piece of antler. Kate, he discovered, had been knitting him a scarf in the evenings after he retired to the barn loft where he slept. On Christmas Eve, they decorated the small cabin with pine boughs and berries. James hung up his stocking with solemn ceremony before being tucked into bed with promises that Santa wouldn't forget the remote Montana farm. Alone by the fire, Matthew and Kate shared a rare glass of cider. "This is the happiest James has been since his father died," Kate said softly. "Having you here, it's made this house feel like a home again." Matthew stared into the flames. "I never thought I'd find peace in staying in one place. Always believed moving on was safer." "And now," Kate asked, her voice barely audible, "now I'm not sure what I believe anymore." He met her gaze. "Except that you're the bravest person I've ever known." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing despite their best intentions. Kate's hand found his, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "Matthew," she whispered, "I never expected to feel this way again. After Thomas, I thought that part of me was buried with him." "I've never felt this way at all," he admitted. "It terrifies me." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question as much as an answer. When they parted, Matthew saw in Kate's eyes the same wonder and uncertainty he felt. I should go, he said reluctantly, rising to return to his cold barn loft. Kate nodded, though her expression spoke of a different wish. Good night, Matthew, Merry Christmas. Christmas Day brought joy as James discovered his gifts, including candy and a small wooden toy from town that Kate must have hidden away months before. They shared a festive meal, played in the snow, and ended the day singing carols around the fire. It was the happiest day Matthew could remember since his parents' death, but happiness on the frontier was often fleeting. 3 days after Christmas, while Matthew was checking their cattle in the north pasture, he spotted riders approaching from the direction of town. Through his spyglass, he recognized Sheriff Davis accompanied by Henderson and another of Simon's men. Matthew raced back to the farmhouse, arriving just as the men dismounted. Mrs. Forrester, the sheriff called, his expression grim beneath his thick mustache. Need to have a word with you and your hired hand. Kate emerged from the house, wiping flour from her hands. Sheriff Davis. What brings you out in this weather? Complaint's been filed, Davis said, not meeting her eyes. Randall Simons claims you're illegally diverting water from the creek that feeds his grazing land. Kate's face registered shock. That's absurd. The creek runs naturally through our property. Nevertheless, I'm here to investigate. The sheriff finally glanced at Matthew, and I understand you've taken on help without proper documentation. Matthew stepped forward. What documentation? Territory law requires employment contracts for farm labor staying more than 30 days, Henderson interjected smugly, to prevent vagrants from claiming squatters' rights. Mr. Quinn is a friend helping through winter, Kate protested. Sheriff Davis shrugged. Still needs papers, ma'am, and I'll need to see your water management. The investigation was clearly a pretext. Davis examined the creek while Henderson and his companion took the opportunity to assess the farm's defenses. Though nothing incriminating was found, the message was clear. Simons was escalating his tactics. After they departed, Matthew turned to Kate. This won't end until he gets what he wants. Or until we can prove he murdered Thomas, Kate replied, her voice steady despite her pale complexion. That evening they formulated a plan. The next supply run to town would include a visit to the territorial capital 50 miles away, where Matthew would file proper employment papers and seek audience with the federal marshal, someone beyond Simon's influence. January brought bitter cold and isolation as snow made travel difficult. The farm became an island unto itself, their days filled with chores and evenings spent in domestic tranquility. Matthew and Kate's relationship deepened, though both were careful to maintain proprieties for James's sake. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, Kate shared more about her husband. Thomas was kind and hardworking, she said as they sat before the fire. We had a good marriage, a partnership, but, Matthew prompted gently when she hesitated. What I feel for you is different, she admitted, color rising in her cheeks. With Thomas, it was comfortable affection that grew into love. With you, her eyes met his. It's as though I've known you always, despite how different our paths have been. Matthew took her hand. I've spent my life believing attachment was weakness, that caring for someone meant giving them power to hurt you. He brushed a strand of honey blonde hair from her face. You've made me question everything I thought I knew. Their kiss that night held promise and passion that both thrilled and frightened him. For the first time, Matthew could envision a future, one with Kate and James, building something permanent on this land they all loved. When weather permitted travel in early February, Matthew made the journey to town for supplies and to implement their plan. The territorial capital was a 3-day ride in good conditions. He promised to return within 2 weeks. Be careful, Kate said as he prepared to depart. Simons has eyes everywhere. I'll be back before you know it, Matthew assured her, kissing her goodbye with James watching wide-eyed from the porch. The journey to Helena proved more challenging than anticipated. A late winter storm delayed him for days in a mountain pass. When he finally reached the territorial capital, he discovered the federal marshal was away investigating Indian troubles to the north. Nevertheless, Matthew filed the proper employment papers and documented Kate's complaints about Simon's intimidation tactics. He found a sympathetic ear in a clerk who promised to bring the matter to the marshal's attention upon his return. Not the first complaint about Simons, the clerk confided. Man thinks he's above the law because he feeds half the territory with his beef. Matthew purchased supplies and began the journey home, anxiety growing with each passing day. He'd been gone nearly 3 weeks, far longer than planned. The weather had turned mild, melting much of the snow and making travel easier but feeding his worry about what might have transpired in his absence. His fears proved justified when he crested the final hill overlooking the Forrester farm. Even from a distance, he could see something was wrong. The front door hung open, and no smoke rose from the chimney despite the evening chill. Spurring his horse forward, Matthew approached cautiously, his hand on his revolver. The farmyard was eerily silent, no chickens scratching, no greeting from James. "Kate," he called, dismounting and rushing toward the house.
James.
The interior had been ransacked, furniture overturned, Kate's precious books scattered across the floor, but no blood, no signs of violence. Matthew searched the barn and outbuildings with growing panic, finding no trace of Kate or James. A sound behind him made him whirl, gun drawn, to find Wilkins from the general store. "Quinn," the storekeeper exclaimed, raising his hands. "Thank God you're back."
Where are they? Matthew demanded. Wilkins' expression was grave.
"Simon's men took them 4 days ago, claimed Kate murdered her husband for the insurance money. Sheriff arrested her, but instead of the town jail, they took her to Simon's ranch, the boy too."
Insurance money. What are you talking about?
"Letter came for her while you were gone. Life insurance policy Thomas had taken out in Boston, $5,000. Wilkins shook his head. "Simons is claiming she killed Thomas for the money, then invented the story about his men to cover her tracks."
Matthew holstered his weapon, his mind racing. It's nonsense.
"Why would she wait all this time to collect if that was her plan?" "Doesn't matter if it makes sense," Wilkins said grimly. "Simons has the sheriff in his pocket and half the town believes whatever he says. Word is they're holding a trial at his ranch tomorrow, just for show, of course."
Cold rage filled Matthew. How many men at Simon's ranch? 10, maybe 15 hands, plus Henderson and his boys. Wilkins studied Matthew's face.
"You're not thinking of going there alone."
"I don't have a choice." Matthew began gathering ammunition and supplies.
"That's suicide, Quinn, even if you're as good with that gun as they say."
Matthew paused. "Who says I'm good with a gun?"
Wilkins looked uncomfortable. "After you left, some drummer passing through recognized your name, said Matthew Quinn was a legend in Wyoming territory.
Said you gunned down 3 rustlers single-handed 2 years back."
"That was self-defense," Matthew said quietly, "not something I'm proud of." "Proud or not, you'll need more than reputation to get them out of Simon's compound." Wilkins hesitated. "I might know some folks willing to help, smaller ranchers who have also suffered from Simon's tactics." By dawn, Matthew had assembled a small force of 5 men, neighboring farmers and ranchers with grievances against Simons. None were gunfighters, but all were determined to see justice done. "We need proof Simons was behind Thomas's murder," Matthew told them as they formulated their plan.
"Without it, even if we rescue Kate and James, they'll never be safe."
One of the men, a weather-beaten farmer named Erickson, spoke up. "My boy works as a stable hand at Simon's place.
Might be able to get a message in."
The plan they devised was dangerous, but offered their best chance. Erickson's son would warn Kate to be ready while also searching for any evidence linking Simons to Thomas's death. Meanwhile, Matthew and the others would approach from different directions at dusk, when the ranch hands would be occupied with dinner. The wait through that day was agonizing. Matthew cleaned his revolver repeatedly, checked his ammunition, and fought to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. Not fear for himself, but for Kate and James, the family he never expected to find, the people who had shown him that love wasn't weakness but the greatest strength of all. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Erickson's son returned with news. "Got a message to Mrs. Forrester," the young man reported. "She and the boy are being held in a back room of the main house. She says to tell you Thomas's watch is the key, something about the time it stopped." "Did you find anything that might help us?" Matthew asked. The boy nodded excitedly. "Henderson keeps a ledger in his quarters. Records of all Simon's special jobs. I couldn't take it, but I saw Thomas Forrester's name with a payment of $500 next to it, dated the day he died."
Matthew's jaw tightened. "That's what we need. When we go in, that ledger is as important as getting Kate and James out safely."
As dusk gathered, the men took their positions around the sprawling Simons ranch. Matthew approached from the north, using a dry creek bed for cover. The main house stood at the center of the compound, a 2-story structure that spoke of Simon's wealth and power. Gunfire erupted from the eastern edge of the property, the diversion they'd planned. As ranch hands rushed to investigate, Matthew slipped closer to the house, dispatching a lone guard with the butt of his revolver. He entered through a side door, finding himself in a quiet hallway. Voices drifted from a large room ahead, Simons and Sheriff Davis, discussing the next day's trial with the confidence of men who'd already determined the outcome. "Once we hang the widow, the boy becomes a ward of the county," Simons was saying. "I'll generously offer to take him in, of course. No one will question my claim to the land then." "Pretty elaborate plan just for water rights," the sheriff commented. Simons laughed. "That valley will be worth 20 times what it is now when the railroad comes through next year. Information I paid good money to acquire." Matthew considered confronting them immediately, but knew finding Kate and James took priority. He moved silently down the hallway, checking rooms until he heard a child's muffled sob. The door was locked, but a well-placed kick splintered the frame. Inside, Kate sat on a small bed with James clutched to her side. Her face lit with relief when she saw Matthew. "You came," she whispered, rising to embrace him. "Always," he replied, holding her tightly before kneeling to reassure James. "We're getting out of here, partner. But we need to be very quiet." "Henderson's ledger," Kate said urgently. "It's our only chance to prove what happened to Thomas." Matthew nodded. "I know where it is. You two follow me, and if anything happens, run for the creek bed to the north. Erickson and the others are waiting." They moved cautiously through the house, avoiding the main room where Simons and the sheriff continued their conversation. Henderson's quarters were located in a small side wing. Matthew picked the lock with skills acquired in less reputable days of his youth. The ledger lay on a desk, exactly as described. Kate flipped through it frantically until she found the entry, Thomas Forrester's name, the date of his death, and the payment of $500 with a notation. "Problem resolved permanently." "This proves it," she breathed. A floorboard creaked behind them. Matthew whirled to find Henderson standing in the doorway, gun already drawn. "Well, well," the man sneered. "The hero returns." Matthew positioned himself between Henderson and Kate. "It's over, Henderson. We have the ledger. Only if you live to show it to someone who cares." Henderson's finger tightened on the trigger. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion. James, terrified, broke from his mother's grasp and ran. Henderson's attention shifted for a crucial second. Matthew drew and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet finding Henderson's shoulder. The man's gun discharged into the ceiling as he fell. The shot brought shouts from elsewhere in the house. Matthew grabbed the ledger, ushering Kate and James toward the rear exit. They emerged into the gathering darkness as Simons and several ranch hands converged on Henderson's quarters. "Run," Matthew urged, firing twice more to cover their retreat. They sprinted for the creek bed, bullets kicking up dirt around them. Kate clutched James to her chest, the ledger secured inside her dress. Matthew provided covering fire, his accuracy keeping their pursuers at bay long enough to reach the relative safety of the depression. Erickson and the others opened fire from concealed positions, creating enough confusion for Matthew, Kate, and James to slip away into the darkness. They regrouped a mile away where horses waited. "We need to reach the federal marshal," Matthew said as they mounted, "with the ledger and Thomas's watch as evidence." "The watch?" Kate questioned, breathless from their flight. "You said it stopped at 7:42, but Simons claimed to be at a town meeting until 8. If we can prove he lied about his alibi." Understanding dawned in Kate's eyes. "The town clerk keeps minutes of all meetings, including when they start and end." They rode hard through the night, avoiding the main roads. By morning, they reached a telegraph office in a neighboring settlement, sending urgent messages to both the federal marshal and the territorial governor. With Henderson's ledger as evidence and the discrepancy in Simon's alibi, the authorities could no longer ignore the situation. 3 days later, federal marshals arrived to arrest Randall Simons and Sheriff Davis on charges of conspiracy and murder. Henderson, recovered from his wound, turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency, providing detailed testimony about Thomas Forrester's murder and Simon's other crimes. As spring approached, the Forrester farm began to flourish once more. The life insurance money Kate had received, the very thing Simons had tried to use against her, allowed her to hire proper help and purchase additional cattle. Water flowed freely through the creek now that Simon's illegal diversions had been removed. On a warm April evening, Matthew found Kate on the porch, watching James play with a new puppy in the yard. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, joining her. "This place could use some expansion, perhaps a larger barn, maybe even another bedroom in the house." Kate turned to him, a smile playing at her lips. Are you proposing improvements to my farm, Mr. Quinn? I'm proposing more than that. Matthew took her hand, his expression serious. When I rode into Silverdale last fall, I believed a man survived by staying alone, by never putting down roots. You showed me how wrong I was. He knelt before her, producing a simple gold band. Katherine Forrester, I may be the poorest cowboy in Montana, but if you'll have me, I promise to spend my life making you and James happy. Will you marry me? Tears glistened in Kate's eyes. You're not poor at all, Matthew Quinn. You have the richest heart of any man I've known. She pulled him to his feet. Yes, I'll marry you. Their wedding took place in May, with wildflowers carpeting the valley and new calves dotting the pastures. The small church in Silverdale overflowed with well-wishers, neighboring farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk who had stood with them against injustice. James proudly served as ring-bearer, beaming as he officially gained a father. After the ceremony, the boy tugged at Matthew's sleeve. Does this mean I can call you Pa now? He asked hopefully. Matthew lifted him into his arms. Nothing would make me prouder, son. That evening, as they stood together on the porch of what was now their shared home, Matthew marveled at how completely his life had transformed. I came to Montana with nothing but the clothes on my back, he said, his arm around Kate's waist as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Now I have everything I never knew I wanted. Kate leaned into his embrace. And I thought I'd lost everything when Thomas died. I never imagined finding love again. The poorest cowboy and the struggling widow, Matthew mused. Who would have thought we'd end up the richest people in Montana territory? Not rich in money, Kate corrected with a smile. No, Matthew agreed, kissing her gently, rich in all the ways that truly matter. As darkness settled over the valley that would be their legacy to James, and the children they hoped would follow, Matthew Quinn finally understood what he'd been searching for all those years on the lonely trails. Not escape, not isolation, but this. A home, a family, and a love strong enough to overcome even the harshest challenges of the frontier.